Hey guys, I'm Kamino. I'm from London, but I live in New York, and I've got releases on Armada Subject, Armada, Off the Grid, Techni, South of Saturn, and more. And yeah, today we're going to be going over Call on Me, which is my new track out on John Summit's Off the Grid label. Basically, I'm just going to go through how I made the track, some of the mixing decisions, sample selection, sound design, all that stuff. And yeah, let's get stuck in. All right, guys. So I made this track using my template, which I've built over the years, and you can download in the description of this YouTube video. Basically, it splits up everything and groups everything in a way which I think really helps flow and just helps you get in the zone. I've taken all my samples out and all the plugins, and you should fill it with your own. And hopefully, it's a big help. So yeah, I think we should get started now. So here's what the track sounds like. Yeah, so that's Call on Me. And the way I started this track was by starting with a kick. And I'm pretty sure that initially I started with just a 4 on the floor pattern. And then I added these accents that you can see here, the ones that have lower velocity. And if I solo it, you can already hear like the whole groove in the track in those kicks. The reason I put those accents there is because I made the bass, which I'm just going to solo now. And it's nice, but it's nothing special. And the rhythm of it was good, but it didn't really have like a percussive sound to it that I thought would fit the track really well. So when I solo the 2, you can kind of hear that thundering bass layered with like, you know, these plucky kicks on top of it. And that really helps the groove of the track and also like the power of the bass line. Here's what it sounds like in context. In terms of the sound design of the bass, it's actually very straightforward. There are 3 layers, but the first is just, you know, 2 oscillators. One of them's playing a saw wave, and then the other one's also playing a saw wave. This one's up 7 semitones. The level's slightly down. It has more voices, and the other ones kind of spread out the sound a bit. And then there's a sub that's just a sine wave. And in the effects, there's nothing. It's just there's a bit of envelope modulation on the cutoff, but it's really straightforward. And I've been using Serum for like probably 6 years non-stop, and it's my go-to synth. And what I found is just the simple stuff works best, you know. Leave your processing. I usually leave my processing like externally with plugins. Sometimes I use the effects, but very rarely. And if you can get a sound to sound good like this, then like you're good to go pretty much. I did very little processing on this. I think I added a trash to saturate the low end a bit, but not much else. The other layers, I think, are the same. Let's have a look. This one's slightly different. This one's obviously, the low's been cut from it. But again, no effects, saw wave. This one has a bit of a modulation on the pitch to kind of give it that click that you hear at the beginning. And then, you know, altogether, it's just like this. Oh, there's another layer. Oh, it's basically not doing anything. So yeah, just 2 layers pretty much. In terms of processing on the group, yeah, so I tried to do that trick where you take the fundamental frequency of the kick and you remove it from the bass. In this case, you can see the kick had a fundamental of about 43 hertz. But I tried it and it didn't sound good, so I turned it off. And I think there's actually quite a lot of interference between the kick and the bass, you know, in terms of like what's correct. It's probably not too correct in terms of mixing. You can see that there's obviously these kicks that are happening together with the bass notes, and usually you would have to sidechain those when there's an overlap, but I didn't, and it still sounds good. There's that old adage, you know, you've got to know the rules to break them, and this is breaking the rules a bit. It still sounds great, so it's fine. And then did I do any processing on the kick? Yes, there's a bit more on the kick. It was redlining when I made it, and instead of turning it down and turning everything else in the track down, I just put a limiter and was like, sounds good, so why not? There's a Fat Filter Saturn. It's on the default setting. I use this plugin a lot, and it just added a warmth that I was after. Just literally, I didn't even change the mix or the drive or the preset or anything. It just sounded great as is. There's an EQ boosting some of the lows, taking out some of those more resonant mids. yeah, there's quite a lot of that going on in the track, that specific kind of low mid-ish range. So taking that out, I think, was quite beneficial. And then this is just not doing anything, so that shouldn't even be there. Cool, that's pretty much the kick and the bass wrapped up. After that, I did the drums. And usually I do kick and then drums, and then I make the bass. But in this case, I kind of like switched it up a little bit. When I make my tracks, I start by laying down samples in MIDI. So perks, claps, hats, and then sometimes I'll just do a bunch of 909 and 606s, just like the most classic house samples, like the 909 hi-hat, like the 909 clap. In this case, I didn't. I just used a bunch of my own samples. Here's what it sounds like without the loops, just so you kind of hear what's going on. The foundation of the groove is there, but it's quite weak. And together with the loops, obviously, it's just a lot fatter. If you go into the loops, I actually used another loop from one of my other tracks that's unreleased. This one's really nice. It's got a really nice groove to it, and that loop, it's got like 6 or 7 hi-hats and claps in it. It's like really fat. And what I would recommend is, well, one, bouncing out any loop that you make that sounds good. So if you have a good drum groove, bounce it out and use it in other tracks, especially if it sounds good. But also, this is more like my style, but like this whole idea of layering this much is pretty beneficial to getting a thick high end. This is actually exemplified quite well in the claps. So there's like a lot of layers here. There's 7 layers of claps. And it's not just like random samples, right? This one, that's like this wet sound. That's like this crunchy sound. That's like a high end wet sound. And like, for example, if I solo these 2 wet ones together, that's quite a nice sound, right? And if I solo these 3, that starts to sound like quite fat. And then you got other ones down here that are panned to left and right. And there's fat snare in the middle of it. And basically all of these samples have a purpose, which is to fill out the frequency spectrum as much as possible, right? You've got mids, you got high mids, you got highs, and then all these textures throughout, and that kind of helps create this super full sound. It's kind of like that concept of the wall of sound that Phil Spector had in the 60s, but, transposed to just high end of drums in tech house. The hats, not as many samples as sometimes I have. The majority of the thickness in the hats comes from the loops. And if I solo the loops by themselves, there's obviously a lot going on here. So yeah, altogether, it sounds like this. And I don't think I did much processing. There's a FabFilter Saturn with the the presence boosted a bit. I think presence is kind of like a mixture of high end and width boosting. They're not very clear about what it does, but it sounds great. And then I EQ'd out nothing. This isn't doing anything. On the groups themselves, I'm taking out the lows at around 150. Here I'm taking out a lows again at 150. Got an LFO tool to kind of like, I guess, just tailor the sound a bit more on the claps. The fills are basically just a bunch of different loops stitched together. You can kind of see what I did here. There's just like all these different fill loops that are, right, it doesn't particularly sound good on its own, it just works in the context of the track. Again, loops, 150, and then the perks, I have taken those out at about 80, which is interesting. I've actually left quite a lot of lows and low mids in this track. Usually I cut a bit higher. Yeah, there's quite a lot of activity down there, which makes sense as to why I did that. I don't really do much processing on individual tracks, and that concept is called top-down mixing. So I tend to just mix groups rather than mix individual tracks unless they really need it, of course. But yeah, I feel like that helps. 1, it helps processing like your CPU, and 2, it just helps you get a more cohesive sound. Do like the gain staging properly in the groups, and then you don't even have to do it to the individual tracks. I didn't do any compression. I just did saturation. This is kind of a controversial statement, but I think if your gain staging is good enough, you don't really need to compress. However, sometimes the samples you've chosen are too dynamic, so you'll need to compress in those instances. Because of how layered these drums are, they kind of compress themselves. There's just no dynamics to begin with. Like, it's all the same volume. It's just like this fat hat and clap playing literally just perfectly in a balanced way. Could compression have helped a bit more? Probably, but it wouldn't have made a big difference, I don't think. That being said, there are a lot of tracks that I do compression, but that's usually because my gain staging just wasn't good enough. Yeah, so those are the drums, and now let's look at the synths and sound design that I did for these. So I tend to use a lot of loops for my drums, and I tend to make all the sounds myself. I don't think it really matters if you use loops. You can do loops, you can do sound design, you could design all of your drums using a vintage 80s analog piece of gear. I don't think it makes you a better producer than if you just use some cool loops. And this is coming from someone who like does pretty much every single sound in his tracks using synthesis. There's a lot going on in this sound. This is the lead. I'll just play it for you. It does sound quite complex, but again, just basic shapes, right? And oh wow, there's a square wave. I think that's the only square wave I use in this track, and the rest is all saws and like sines for subs. These are all off, so there's no effects. It's crazy how you know when you start producing, you think, oh, I need to like add all these layers and stuff, but then it's literally just one layer, and it sounds great as is, and all the complexity comes from the processing, not the sound design itself. So what's going on is basically the cutoff is just being modulated. I did this by hand, obviously, hence why it's so jaggedy and stuff. And then I think I also did, I don't even know what that is, some pitch bend stuff. I've got a slapback delay going. As I said, trash, doing some saturation. Oh, that's cool. I added a bit of reverb, really short, 0.5 seconds. That helps it. Plate is very flat sounding, which is like perfect for the sound. I took out some of the lows. I think I changed the size a bit. Yeah, it's pretty relatively straightforward. Saturn isn't really doing it. Yeah, clean tube preset. Clean tube is very nice sound. It's very like polished. Warm tube is very warm, analog sounding. Added some more presence. Multiband compressor basically pulling down the highs a tiny bit, because obviously it's like the cutoff goes quite high, so like something to rein it down a bit it's really not doing much, if anything. Okay, Fab Filter Pro Q is lifting up the high end a bit. Yeah, just really, you can see a lot of these are pushing the high end, helping like the clarity of the sound overall. And then I pull down the width of it a bit, because everything in the track was like quite wide, so I didn't want it to be on the sides, more like in the middle. And yeah, that's that sound covered. Then we've got, what's this? That's just the synth again. Or what? So many delays. So that's just a riser synth that I made. The way that it works is you have one LFO basically going, you know, modulating the course, which is pitch, basically. It's pitch without steps. And then I have that LFO also modulating the level and the cutoff, some reverb on it. And then this is not doing anything. And then it's just one LFO. Yeah, there you go. And the reason it sounds like it's going faster is because the rate is being modulated here. It's actually quite simple. See, it's just like, and it sounds great. So like, just simplicity is the key, as with everything, and saw waves. Simplicity and saw waves. Yeah, usually when I do some LFO action, even in the more complicated sounds I have, where I have like 8 LFOs, they tend to be mapped to many parameters. So like one of them will be mapped to many parameters, and that helps make like keep it cohesive. I could have used a different LFO to modulate the levels, but then it would have sounded weird probably. It's also modulating the cutoff here, and got a bit of drive to help boost its fatness. And then I don't think there's really any processing. It's just I double down on the EQ to make sure the low end is gone. They kind of lie to EQs, like even though you would think that it would take all of this out, it doesn't really. It leaves a lot of it. You can even see it here, right? It stays. Unless you use like an engineer's filter, it's going to stay there. But it's usually a good thing, because engineered filters are very aggressive, and they kind of like, they don't really sound very natural. Here we have, all right, let's have a guess to what wave this is. Yeah, again, more detailed on this one, really spread out, 13 waves, some reverb, envelope, cutoff on the cutoff, done. I make all my pads, I make all my plucks, I make all my basses, and I make all my leads with saw waves. So yeah, it kind of says it all. That's it even sounds like a sine wave, but it's saw waves. Yeah, so that's just on the coarse pitch, just creating like a modulation in the pitch. Again, pretty straightforward. I don't think there's any effects. Yeah, I think I used one preset in this track, the Spire preset, to create this kind of like, it's pretty cool. I can't really hear it in the track. It's interesting. Cool, and then the vocals. Wait, did I do any processing to the synths? Just took out the low end. You may have noticed all my side chains are quite aggressive. I do that because I just like the way that sounds. My release is usually set at 60, my attack at 2 milliseconds. That's my default. I feel like it releases the sound right like in between each beat, which is my style. I think really nice. The vocals, a lot of people ask me how I made these.
Crazy. Me.
It's just slap back delay and then chops and reverses. You kind of see I was just playing with it here.
Call.
It just takes me a lot of time to do these, especially here in the second build up. Like there's a lot of
I have you on repeat, grasping for tender moments.
like there's a lot of stretching and reversing, and like this took me hours to do. Obviously, like the experimentation, trying to figure out what was right. But yeah, I don't really have any like tips on plugins for that. I just kind of did it by hand. It's just all audio basically, and I think some delays, reverbs, and soothe. I think I may have used Little Alter Boy, pitch things down. Yeah, and then the effects are just I use Operator a lot to basically make white noise risers. If you put phaser or flanger on it, it can usually sound really nice. I think that's what I did here. Yeah, and then I used a lot of Cashmere and other sweeps and that kind of stuff. Yeah, I think in my style, transitional elements like these are really, really important, and without them, it kind of sounds bland. It's like a way to just create energy that otherwise would be slightly lacking. And then I tried using a vinyl crack onto the track at one point, but didn't end up using it because there's so much going on that I really didn't need to. Yeah, there's what, 94, maybe like 90 used layers in this track, and this took me probably around 30 hours to finish. And sometimes the best tracks are the ones that finished really quickly. I made this one and finished it, sent it to John, and then he signed it for Off the Grid in like 3 hours. So sometimes putting a lot of effort into tracks works, sometimes it doesn't. Most people who have made hits though will tell you that the ones that were hits were the ones that took them like a few hours to make, which I think is quite interesting and doesn't really fit the way I make music because it's so layered. But maybe that'll change in the future, who knows? So the last thing to look at is the mastering, and this is quite involved, and I'm also a mastering engineer, so I went in on this, and I told you before that I don't really do much compression in my tracks. That's because I do a lot of it in the mastering chain. So the first thing that I've started using recently, which is this amazing plugin called Gulfos, which is basically a dynamic EQ that I'll just show you.
Call on me.
It's honestly mind-blowing. Like, it responds to incoming signal and balances out according to your preferences. I've never used one this good. I've just started using it recently. I turned these all off, by the way, because they just melt my CPU when I have them on. Usually I would do this in a separate project because the CPU overloading. I have a gaming computer, and even then it's just ruining my laptop. I would strongly recommend Gulfos. It's quite expensive, but it's worth it if you're trying to do mastering properly. If you're like beginner, intermediate, or even advanced, and you don't really want to bother with doing all this, you can just slap a limiter on the chain, use a mastering reference like I did for loudness. I used Pack Snake and also Bilingual, which is a track I mastered for the VA as well, by Kai William. Great tune. Both of these are fantastic tunes. They're quite loud. And just use a reference, use a limiter, take out the lows like below 27 and above like 16, 17, and just, put a limiter on it and call it a day. Because labels, for the most part, they're not going to be like, it's not mastered to minus 6.5 LUFS, so we're not going to take it. They just want it to be loud enough so they can play it out and test it out. But yeah, I'll just go into what I did for this mastering. I took out that's interesting. I took out some sub that was, I guess, just either too resonant or just like a bit too much. Boosted the highs at the mids, a little bit, 0.4 dB, and then boosted the highs a little bit. I take out everything, like I do quite harsh cuts. Personally, I can't hit anything above this level, and I'm pretty sure most people who go clubbing a lot can't either because their ears are messed up. I take out below 27. You can go between 25 and 30. It doesn't really matter. And it's just extra signal that's taking up headroom. I use Ozone 8 for its multiband compressor. I actually had to master this relatively quickly because when I sent it to John, he needed it like on the day for distribution. So I didn't really mess too much with ratios and knees, and I probably would have used a different multiband compressor if I had the time, and like I would have tried different ones. Usually I go for Pro MB, C4, this, and then Waves, linear phase one as well. So there's like probably minus 1 dB reduction across the very slight in the mids. Good tip if you're getting started mastering and want to figure out how to do multiband compression. Go from slower attack and progressively higher and higher and higher until you hit the highs. That's because the transients of the sound get quicker and quicker as you go up the spectrum. One thing I did here, which is pretty cool tip, I used 2 limiters. The first is Ozone's maximizer, just doing a bit using the balance setting and with a bit of the ceiling, and then I left it's the default attack and release that it has actually quite nice for house music. Yeah, so this is doing like a bit of work, and then the bulk of the mastering is coming from the Pro L2, which is on modern setting, a bit of a look ahead, change these a little bit, turn both of these off, turn off peak limiting, and oversample a little bit just for the sake of it. And then like the reasoning behind this is, 1, you get the flavor of both limiters, and 2, you get, each one has to do less work. So in the end, the result is that you might not get all these like artifacts that you would get if you just used one. I don't really do that much advanced stuff. Sometimes I'll do some expansion. I'll use these like analog EQ emulators, like the Slate digital mixing rack. And there's all clippers and like all this other stuff that you can use to make stuff, sound really professional. But honestly, I did this and it just sounded great, and John needed it, so I shipped it off. And honestly, I think the track sounds great, so I'm pretty happy with it. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. One of the things which actually made this track relatively easy to make is a template. It did take me a long time to finish it, but getting the samples down, getting all the grouping done beforehand is just so helpful, and it's such a waste of time if you have to do it after you make the track. So if you don't have a template or are looking for a better one, if yours doesn't have as much like categorized grouping, go into the description of the video and download mine if you want. And yeah, that's me. Thanks Phantom Sounds for having me on, and I hope you learned something. And if you have any questions about the track, just hit me on the DMs on Instagram. Yeah, have a good one, guys. Cheers.